Jung wrote, "Now the fourth function. Sensation tells us that a thing is. Thinking tells us what a thing is, feeling tells us what it is worth to us. Now what else could there be? Sensation tells us that a sensory thing is. It doesn't tell us anything about non-sensory things. That's the problem. Nor does it tell us about sensory things which do not reach conscious awareness, or sensory things outside the narrow limits of our human senses. Moreover, the senses are frequently delusional and show us things which aren't there, mirages, illusions, hallucinations, and the like. The senses which operate during our dreams are every bit as convincing as those which operate during waking, even though the former are showing us unreality, or subjective reality, while the latter supposedly show us objective reality, and even though the former do not utilize physical sense organs. You're not physically using your eyes, for example, when you dream, even though you are constantly looking at things with your mental eyes. And what about inattentional blindness? Wikipedia says, inattentional blindness or perceptual blindness occurs when an individual fails to perceive an unexpected stimulus in plain sight, purely as a result of a lack of attention rather than any vision defects or deficits. When it becomes impossible to attend to all the stimuli in a given situation, a temporary blindness effect can occur, as individuals fail to see unexpected but often salient objects or stimuli. Remember the infamous invisible gorilla? Wikipedia says, The Invisible Gorilla is a book published in 2010, co-authored by Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons. The title of this book refers to an earlier research project by Chabris and Simons revealing that people who are focused on one thing can easily overlook something else. To demonstrate this effect, they created a video where students pass a basketball between themselves. Viewers asked to count the number of times the players with the white shirts pass the ball often fail to notice a person in a gorilla suit who appears in the center of the image, an experiment described as one of the most famous psychological demos ever. We can literally fail to notice what is right in front of our eyes, and invent something that isn't in front of our eyes. Those people who didn't see the gorilla actually there in front of them were therefore seeing something else that wasn't there. If materialism is true, how can people not see what matter is there and instead see what matter is not there? What about the distinction between primary and secondary properties? Encyclopaedia Britannica says, the Cartesian theory of knowledge through representative ideas is rooted in Galileo's distinction between real, or primary, properties of material bodies, such as size, shape, position, and motion or rest, which were thought to exist in bodies themselves, and sensible, or secondary, properties, such as colors, tactile feelings, sounds, odors, and tastes, which were thought to exist only in the mind. As Descartes assumes in his theory of light and as Locke later argued, secondary properties of bodies do not exist in bodies themselves but are the result of the interaction of distinctive arrangements of primary properties with the human sense organs. According to Locke, however, our sensible ideas of the size, shape, position, and motion or rest of particular bodies resemble their corresponding primary properties and so can be a source of knowledge about them. Nevertheless, against this claim it is still possible to raise the skeptical objection that, because mental and material substances are radically distinct, and because all ideas are mental, no idea, not even an idea of a primary property, can resemble a material object. Bishop Berkeley, an immaterialist, said, "To be is to be perceived, i.e., only the act of perceiving makes a thing real." Quantum mechanics says something similar. It claims that things are very different under observation than they are unobserved. Berkeley insisted that we can know nothing at all about the alleged properties of matter, we can only know about our ideas regarding matter, and so there is no reason to suppose that matter, independent of our ideas of it, exists at all. It would be bizarre to have a material world we know nothing about and a mental world we do know about. These two worlds cannot coexist. One of them is superfluous, the material world believed in by science. There is no such world. Kant claimed that sensory things are unknowable in themselves and what we know about them is constructed via faculties of the mind. So, only in the most naive sense do the senses show us what is. They are staggeringly deceptive and generate countless issues of interpretation, all of which are ignored by science. Science basically believes that what we see is what is actually there, an absurdly naive position. All of us internally, mentally, construct the world, using sensory clues and cues from the external world, which are then subjected to enormous internal reconstruction, interpretation and presentation. The idea that there is any world beyond the mind is impossible to prove, and Occam's razor tells us that such a world would be wholly redundant if the mind can construct everything we associate with the material world, which indeed it can. No mind has ever accessed non-mental reality, and none ever could. All matter is contained within mind, as is most obvious when we dream. Imagine an apple. Everything you know about the apple is present to your mind. The apple external to your mind isn't external to all minds. It's their construct. There is no requirement for any other apple, external to all minds. No such apple can exist. Scientific matter is a wholly superfluous hypothesis. Jung wrote, "One would assume one has a complete picture of the world when one knows there is something, what it is, and what it is worth. But there is another category, and that is time. Things have a past and they have a future. They come from somewhere, they go somewhere, and you cannot see where they came from and you cannot know where they go to, but you get what the Americans call a hunch. That is what is called intuition, a sort of divination, a sort of miraculous faculty. Intuition is very different from sensory perception. It's non-sensory perception, i.e., it does not proceed by way of the physical sense organs, or its extrasensory perception, i.e., it proceeds by means not available to the physical sense organs. Whatever it is, it's not anything to do with the senses, hence it is nothing to do with science and its sensory, experimental method." Jung associated intuition with time. That was a highly insightful contribution. The physical sense organs are, by contrast, all about space. They cannot see time or its passage. Humans have to invent sensory objects such as clocks to have a sensory way to physically track the passage of time. But looking at a clock is very different from looking at time and its passage. No one can point at anything and say, "Look, there's time over there. There's a particle of time. There's a box of time. There's a clock, full of time, being moved by time." Analog clocks are physical, spatial mechanisms, designed to model or simulate the passage of time, according to the physical rotation of the Earth, without interacting with actual time at all. No clock actually presents any measurement of ontological time, or contains any indication of what ontological time is. Time is so mysterious to scientists that they cannot say whether it is a substance, an energy, a different form of space, a type of matter, or whatever. So, if the physical senses are about space, they cannot tell us anything about where things came from and where they are going. That's the job of our intuition, our time-dependent sense. Intuition can also furnish information about space far beyond the range of the senses. That's what remote viewing is about. Wikipedia says, remote viewing, RV, is the practice of seeking impressions about a distant or unseen target, purportedly sensing with the mind. This would be possible only if our mind, unlike our body and its physical sense organs, is non-local and connected to everything, hence it can tune into things physically unreachable by the local senses. Between them, the physical senses and intuition perceive the whole of space and can make all sorts of predictions about time. Intuition can also reach into the domain beyond space and time. The physical senses certainly can't do that, which is why science can't access foundational reality, which is immaterial and not part of space and time. It's a mental frequency singularity. Jung wrote, "The word intuition becomes more and more a part of the English language, and you are very fortunate because in other languages that word does not exist. The Germans cannot even make a distinction between sensation and feeling. In fact, there isn't much distinction between sensation and feeling in English either. Sensation is defined in English in such terms as a reaction to external stimulation of the sense organs and a physical feeling or perception resulting from something that happens to or comes into contact with the body. Feeling could easily be described as the sixth sense. It's often a physical response to signals detected in the external environment. Feeling, rather than being the rational opposite of thinking, could easily be defined as an irrational extension of perception, proceeding by way of internal reactivity, perception by the stomach, gut feelings, rather than by external physical sense organs. Jung wrote, "It is different in French. If you speak French, you cannot possibly say that you have a certain sentiment dans l'estomac, feeling in the stomach, you will say sensation. In English, you also have your distinctive words for sensation and feeling. But you can mix up feeling and intuition easily. Many people think a gut feeling is an intuition. But isn't a gut feeling exactly what it says, a deep feeling, sort of located in the gut area? It's your instant emotional judgment of a situation. An intuition, by contrast, is a flash of insight, an instant vision, a profound reading and understanding of a situation based on the flimsiest of data. It's an informational download rather than a feeling, although, of course, it may trigger subsequent feelings and emotional judgments." Jung wrote, "In ordinary conversation, when a man says feeling, he means possibly something entirely different from another fellow who also talks about feeling. There are any number of psychologists who use the word feeling, and they define it as a sort of crippled thought. Feeling is nothing but an unfinished thought, that is the definition of a well-known psychologist. That's actually quite a good definition. A feeling might be regarded as a primitive thought, unsustained by reason and logic, by any coherent argument. It's an instant, reflexive judgment, mediated by an internal pain or pleasure response. It doesn't get round to giving considered reasons for the response. People who are high on the feeling spectrum, such as love and lighters, or people of religious faith, never have reasons for their beliefs. They simply make emotional statements or defiantly proclaim their faith. The idea of intellectually justifying their position never occurs to them. They would consider any such requirement bizarre. Their feelings are all. Everything else is irrelevant." Jung wrote, "But feeling is something genuine, it is something real, it is a function, and therefore we have a word for it. The instinctive natural mind always finds the words that designate things which really have existence. Only psychologists invent words for things that do not exist." Jung had a definite tendency to anti-intellectualism. He certainly wasn't an INTJ. Dr. A.J. Drenth wrote, "While it would be unfair to suggest that INTJs are not religious or interested in spiritual matters, for Jung, these were matters of ultimate importance." If Jung had been a strong thinking type, it seems likely that his penetrating intellect would have led him to study mathematics, the sciences, or philosophy. Instead, he opted to devote the majority of his efforts toward humanistic and religious topics, those which are most commonly embraced by feeling types. Even a cursory exploration of career demographics suggests that religious vocations are of marked and frequent interest to INFJs, while falling lower on the priority list for INTJs. It is also worth noting Jung's regular use of art therapy, both personally as well as with his clients, which is certainly consistent with an INFJ designation. Jung's system would have been much more rigorous if he had been an INTJ. As it was, his system often veered into mysticism. It was brilliantly imaginative, but rarely relied on detailed rational arguments. Jung's primary gift was his intuition. His work is the product of incredibly high intuitive abilities. Jung wrote, "The last defined function, intuition, seems to be very mysterious, and you know I am very mystical as people say. This then is one of my pieces of mysticism. Intuition is a function by which you see round corners, which you really cannot do, yet the fellow will do it for you and you trust him. Seeing round corners is a great way to describe intuition. It does what the physical senses can never do. It extracts information from places that the senses can never reach." Jung wrote, "Intuition, is a function which normally you do not use if you live a regular life within four walls and do regular routine work. But if you are on the stock exchange or in Central Africa, you will use your hunches like anything. You cannot, for instance, calculate whether when you turn round a corner in the bush you will meet a rhinoceros or a tiger, but you get a hunch, and it will perhaps save your life. So you see that people who live exposed to natural conditions use intuition a great deal, and people who risk something in an unknown field, who are pioneers of some sort, will use intuition. Inventors will use it and judges will use it. Whenever you have to deal with strange conditions where you have no established values or established concepts, you will depend upon that faculty of intuition. One of the primary uses of intuition is as a pathfinder. If you want to start any grand work, where do you begin? If you want to explain existence, what will your opening sentence, your starting point, be? If you want to crack the mathematical code of existence, what's the mathematical key you must turn?